In part 2 of chapter 43, we learned how to calculate an instantaneous growth rate. So this is a growth rate at a single point in time. But a growth rate at a single point in time doesn't really tell us how a population is changing over a long period of time. Even if we have two growth rates and we're looking at change over 2 seasons or 2 years or whatever we might be looking at, it's only going to give us a small snapshot of what the population is doing. To get a better picture of how our population is changing over time, what we want to do is look at long periods of time, multiple growth rates over multiple time points, and see how this population is trending. Now, there are two general growth patterns that we see in populations. One is the exponential growth model. The other is the logistic growth model. What I would like you to keep in mind as we talk about these is we are going to be talking about an idealized situation. So in other words, under perfect conditions, if we had perfect data, if these populations were behaving exactly as expected and maybe had only one factor that was affecting their growth or their ability to continue growing, then we would see these ideal conditions. But in real populations, we don't always see these nice, beautiful growth graphs that we're going to look at. And the reason is that in real populations, you have many factors that are affecting those populations. And each year is going to be different. Sometimes there's an unexpected crash in the population or an unexpected boom in the population or something that you were never even expecting affected these guys. And then on top of that, there are just natural fluctuations where populations do better some years than other, even when conditions seem to be generally unchanging. So just keep that in mind, that if we were looking at real populations, what we would probably see is a fluctuation and a general trend that we sort of infer on top of those fluctuations. So we're going to start out talking about the exponential growth rate. So exponential growth happens when resources are not limiting. So just a really simple example, we could think of deer in an urban area. They have unlimited grass, they have lots of food available, maybe people are feeding them. So food is not a limiting resource. So if we just think of that one resource, those deer can just continue to grow unchecked. Now, in a real population, in a natural population, exponential growth, when populations are not limited by anything in their environment, is actually really rare. And while we do see it, it generally only happens for a short period of time, because in a natural environment, something is going to limit the population's ability to grow eventually. Maybe it's that food resource we were talking about, or maybe it's space, or maybe it's water availability, or maybe it's predators. It is very unusual, and there are only a very few specific types of situations where we actually see exponential growth over long periods of time. Now, that's not to say populations never enter exponential growth. In fact, when we look at logistic growth, we're going to see that all populations are starting out probably at some level of exponential growth, and then their pattern is going to shift once those resources become limiting again. So exponential growth is going to be based on something that we call the intrinsic rate of increase. Now, we've already seen the intrinsic rate of increase. That's that value R that we were talking about in our previous video. So we talked about the change in a population being the rate, the growth rate, times the population size. This is actually just our exponential growth formula. And what this formula is saying is that the only thing that's affecting the population is the intrinsic rate at which they can increase. In other words, if conditions are perfect, there are all the resources that this particular population needs, then their maximum rate of growth is just based on the maximum number of babies that all the breeding females in that population can have. So if we're looking at deer, and maybe the maximum number those mamas can have every season is 2, and every female has 2 deer, and they all survive. That's going to be your maximum rate of increase. So again, this is only going to be under ideal conditions. So that means resources are unlimited, and we don't have what we would call density dependent limitation. We'll come back to density dependent limitation, but for now, density dependent limitation just means that as the population begins to grow, the factor that is affecting the individuals affects them more strongly. So for example, if you are a deer population and there are more of you, there are more available for predators to eat. Therefore, more individuals per the population size are going to be eaten by predators than when the population number is low. Another important thing to keep in mind for exponential growth is that because our exponential growth calculation doesn't just depend on the growth rate, but also the population size, what this formula is telling us is that as the population grows as the population grows, their size is going to be exponentially increasing. That means that the larger the population is, the faster the population is going to grow. So, as I said, there are only a few instances where you're going to see exponential growth rate. Usually, those situations are going to be situations where an organism finds itself in an environment, or a population, I should say, finds itself in an environment that has currently unlimited resources. Now, this is probably just going to be temporary, but depending on the time frame that we study, we may or may not see this as temporary. It might appear to be permanent, at least for the frame we're studying. So this could be if a population is reintroduced into a habitat or expands into a habitat that they were not previously in. Maybe they don't have any natural predators there, or there are not a lot of predators there. There's abundant resources because no one else is using them, something like that. We also see this when an exotic species is introduced to a new environment. So exotic species just means a species that's not naturally found there. They can be exotic but not detrimental. So sometimes we have species that are transplanted and then they just go along their merry way. They don't really do anything negative to the environment. But they can also be invasive. And an invasive exotic species is one that does harm in the environment that they enter. So we were going to come back to this concept as well. And then humans are a fabulous example of exponential growth rate. So historically, human population has been very small, but in the last few hundred years or so, we have increased rather dramatically. Again, we will come back to this. And this, again, happens because we are using resources, and humans are a really great example of sort of over-exploiting those resources, making them better for ourselves, so we just appear to have unlimited resources. We've essentially made this situation where our resources are unlimited. So this image is a graph that shows time for a population. So this could be months, it could be years, it could be seasons. And then on the left-hand side, we have our population size. So when we see an exponential growth rate happening, what we're going to see is a very small population size to start. So we start with a small number, and for a little while that population grows kind of slowly, and then we hit a point where bam, all of a sudden it goes up really, really quickly. So as our population increases, it grows more quickly. So these two graphs only differ in the rate of their growth. So they both start with the same number of individuals. It actually can't be 0. You have to have a number of individuals, but a very small number of individuals. The first graph shows a rate of 1. second shows a rate of 0.5. So 0.5 is going to be half the rate of the other one. Now you'll notice that even though the growth rate is smaller, it's taking longer for that population to grow, that it does the same thing. It grows slowly, and then it reaches a tipping point, and then grows really, really quickly. So what we have here is just that exponential growth happening just more or less quickly depending on the population growth rate. So when we see an exponential growth curve, we are going to expect to see a J-shaped curve. Now this one, if it's happening, if exponential growth rate's happening, we're probably going to see that J, even just for a short period of time. So here we have two examples. One is an example of wolves in the interior Northwest United States. In the late 1990s, a small number of wolves were reintroduced into Yellowstone National Park, where they had been missing from there for 50 years or so. And when they were reintroduced, they found themselves in a situation where deer and elk, which are their primary prey species, had essentially been uncontrolled for a number of years. So there were no major predators that were depleting these populations. The wolf prey species was abundant. And so when they were reintroduced in the 90s, small number of them, their population skyrocketed very quickly. Now, if you just think about what is going to happen, this is going to give you a hint as to what comes next. So if these wolves start increasing in number, they're going to start eating more prey species. So just think about what might happen as those prey species begin to drop. And we'll start to see a little bit of what happens when you introduce another population into your mix, and then that becomes community ecology. On the right-hand side, we have the Burmese python. So the Burmese python is an invasive species. So it's not from Florida, it's from Asia, but once it was released into the Florida Everglades, it basically took off. So people had these as pets. They couldn't take care of them. They got too big, they got too expensive, and they released them. So same thing, we've got slow population growth rate and then an increase exponentially. These organisms have no natural predators. They have abundant prey because the animals that they are preying upon do not have defenses against these, because they didn't evolve defenses against these, because the pythons were not historically in this area. So then we get to logistics. So I mentioned the wolves just a minute ago, and we saw our population growth, and we have slow population growth, and then we have an increase. So we've got our wolves increasing. Now, I asked you to think about what happens as the prey species begin to decline. So their main food source, because they've been hunting them, and the more wolves there are, the more they are hunting them. So as the prey species decline, what we're going to see is a decline in the growth rate of that wolf population. And so right here, right about here, we start to see that decline in the population, because a resource in the environment starts to limit the number of individuals that population can reach. The environment begins to dictate how many of those organisms are going to be present and be able to be supported. So for most species, at some point, some resource is going to become limited. What that resource is just depends on the environment. It depends on the species. This point here at the top, where we see this flattening of this curve, that is going to be because the population is nearing something called the carrying capacity. So the carrying capacity is a population size. So this is essentially going to be the equivalent of an N value, but it is the population size that can be supported by the environment. So it is the upper boundary of that population. It is the total number that the environment can support for that particular species. And so if we want to calculate our population growth rate, when resources are limited, we have to include this carrying capacity effect on growth. So carrying capacity is denoted by the letter K. So that's our value, our population size. And this little equation here, K times N divided by K, is going to be the effect of the carrying capacity on the population. And so what we have is a modified equation here where we've got our growth rate and our population size and the effect of the carrying capacity. So this looks a little big and scary. It is literally just plug and chug algebra. You're going to be given a carrying capacity value. So maybe the environment can support 1,000 individuals. You're going to be given a population size. Maybe the current population is 800, and then you'll be given your growth rate, or you know that you can calculate the growth rate based on number of births and number of deaths. So our rate of change for our population, or our increase or decrease, is going to be dependent on one more factor here: the growth rate, the population size, and the number of organisms that the area can support. There are two examples on this page. I would really like you to pause the video and try to do one of these equations, or watch the first one and then pause and try to do the second one. So the equation we're using is going to be the rate of change of the population is the growth rate of the population times the population size divided by our carrying capacity factor. Now keep in mind that you need your order of operations here. So if you are plugging this into a calculator, make sure you're doing it carefully or do it step by step, because your scientific and graphing calculators are fabulous, but sometimes they don't follow their math rules. So make sure that you subtract the top of your equation first. So you're going to do your subtraction here, then you're going to divide it by your carrying capacity, and then you're going to do your multiplication. I encourage my students to show their work just to make sure nothing gets mixed up. You may do it however you would like, as long as your answer comes out correctly, and your answer should be based on correct order of operations. So if we are calculating our rate of change over time, we are going to plug in 0.1 times our population size times our carrying capacity factor divided by 500. So I'm going to go ahead and let you figure that factor out and figure out a population size. When we get down here to the second problem, I've got it worked out over here for you. Again, go ahead and just ignore it. If you want to try it on your own, I'm missing a little value right there. But you can go ahead and try that and see if you can get the numbers that you are expecting. Again, I would like you to think about what's happening with this population. So we've got the same growth rate here, but these individuals in the first population, they only have about half of the carrying capacity, which means that their ability to grow is going to be much faster. There's going to be a greater ability of this group to grow than this one. So what we probably have here is a situation where we've got a small number of individuals and then they start to grow more quickly. Probably what's happening here is that we're going to be shifting somewhere between these population size values, and we're getting closer to that carrying capacity. And so as we get closer to that carrying capacity, the population size is going to level out. And eventually what we're going to see is that this population should level at or near 1,000. So up here, when we have 500 individuals, there's a lot of room for growth. Down here, where we already have 900 individuals, there's not nearly as much room for growth. So if you look down here, we've only added 9 individuals. That means that that environment is starting to limit the number of individuals in this population. So here we have the logistic growth pattern. We've got exponential here for comparison. That's our J-shaped curve. And then over here we have our logistic curve. The general shape of that logistic curve is going to be an S-shaped curve. It's a flattened S, but a bit of an S-shaped curve. So we see the same thing happening. We see the population size starting out slowly, and then as it grows, it actually reaches an exponential growth rate. But then right around 50% of carrying capacity, it actually switches from logistic exponential growth to logistic growth. So right there at that 50% mark, you can see that the growth rate actually starts to slow down a little bit. And then as we get closer to that carrying capacity, it slows down even more and levels out. Now this is really where I said that we don't see this exact pattern in a real population. Because what is actually probably happening here is that your population is growing exponentially, and then it's going to slow down a bit, but it's probably going to overshoot. So then maybe it's going to crash. And then it's going to grow a little bit, and then it's going to crash. And then maybe something makes it crash really hard. And then maybe it grows slowly for a little while, and it increases, and then it sort of settles around that carrying capacity. So in a real population, we may not see this lovely S-curve. We might see a nice S-curve here, and then we've got some fluctuation here, and then a crash, and then maybe a slow growth fluctuating, and then eventually fluctuating around that carrying capacity. So this is going to be a general model that's probably going to fit most populations, because most populations are going to be limited by what's happening in the particular area. But natural populations are always fluctuating. So in nature, resources are constantly going to change. The actual carrying capacity is probably going to change. Outside factors are going to affect. So there might be multiple resources that are limiting, making it even worse. So again, as I said, these are idealized situations. We won't see exponential for very long. And if we do see exponential, it's probably going to switch over to logistic growth at some point. Sorry, technical difficulties there. All right, so here's an example of a logistic growth curve for yeast cells. So these guys are in a fixed environment with a fixed level of nutrients. So back in Biology 101, we did a cellular respiration lab where we had yeast in a flask, and you all measured the carbon dioxide output. But those yeast were provided a set of resources. And in that flask was a limited number of resources. And so when those yeast are first put into that flask, they are small in number and lots of resources because we want them to grow. So we give them a lot of sugars and whatnot for them to use. And so what's going to happen is when they first start growing, they're going to grow kind of slowly because there's a small number of them. And then we're going to get more and more. And then again, right about half of the carrying capacity or so, they're going to start to slowly use up those resources. And so they're not really going to grow quite as fast. And so as we get closer to that carrying capacity, they're going to slow down their growth rate. Eventually, and again, in an idealized population, their growth rate is going to be 0. Now, that does not mean that there are no individuals being born. It means that they are being born at the same rate as they are dying. So it just means that the number of individuals in the population is not increasing. It does not mean that they stop having offspring. It just means that they stop increasing.